Hello, everyone. Hello. My name is Brian Jones. I'm the Associate Director of Education at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and I'm thrilled to greet you and welcome you back to the 8th season of Conversations in Black Freedom Studies, virtual edition. Thanks so much for joining us. And while we're at it, thanks to Carola Ignatz for live captioning tonight's event for the hearing impaired or anyone who wants live captions. We will paste instructions in the chat for viewing those captions. The Schomburg Center, a world-renowned institution dedicated to archiving, studying, and interpreting the global Black experience, is celebrating its 95th year. And we have a lot of virtual and digital offerings in store, including a Black Liberation reading list, our second annual literary festival at the end of this month, and much more, all of which you can explore by visiting schomburgcenter.org. Today, we're gathering to talk about how we got here, the long struggle for educational justice in New York. In this back to school season, unlike any other, a season of tremendous anxiety, stress, fear, and suffering, we hope today's discussion can shed some light. Two new resources to anchor our thinking are Educating Harlem, A Century of Schooling and Resistance in a Black Community, edited by Ansley Erickson and Ernest Morrell. Ernest Morrell will join us in a moment. And What's Race Got to Do with It? How Current School Reform Policy Maintains Racial and Economic Inequality, the second edition, recently updated, edited by Edwin Mayorga, Ujju Aggarwal, Ujju will join us in a moment, and Bree Pickauer. So those authors, those co-editors will be with us in a moment, and Terrenda White, who coincidentally contributed to both books. Way back in the before times, audience members at an event like this would purchase these books at the Schomburg shop and then have the authors sign them. Today, we're going to ask you to still purchase them from the Schomburg shop, schomburgshop.com, while supplies last. And if supplies don't last, and they're no longer available from our shop, you can still purchase them anywhere else you buy books. Virtual events are not the same as gathering in person, but they do create some new opportunities for engagement. For example, when we get to the last portion of our agenda tonight, if you want to ask a question of our speakers, you can click on the Q&A menu item, which for most of you here in the Zoom window will be near the bottom of your window, of the application window. If you're watching on YouTube, you can type a question into the YouTube chat box. Type your question into the box that pops up, use the Q&A question, use the Q&A feature of Zoom if you're in Zoom, and indicate to us whether or not you want us to read your question, or if you want to read or if you want to say your question or ask your question yourself. Now, I should say this event is being recorded and will be available for anyone to view after the fact on the Schomburg Center's live stream page. The default is that all of you watching will remain anonymous in that recording. If we read out your question, we will only mention your first name to preserve your anonymity. But if you indicate that you want to ask a question yourself, we may make you temporarily visible and audible, in which case you will be in the recording. And this is a really important discussion, and I'm quite certain we won't get to every question, but we'll do our best. Feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. And remember, please indicate whether you want us to read it or if you want to ask the question yourself. And we'll get to questions at the last part of tonight's agenda. And now I'd like to bring on stage my co-moderator, the co-founder of the Conversations in Black Freedom Studies series, Brooklyn College professor of political science, Jean Theoharis. Welcome, Jean.
Thank you, Brian. It's so wonderful to be here. It's so wonderful to be with all of you. I imagine we have people who are longtime fans of Conversations and also new people who can come for the first time because of our new format. But it's really exciting to be here. So we started this series 8 years ago. Kamosi Woodard, a professor at Sarah Lawrence College, and I started it in part because there were fewer and fewer spaces. Bookstores were closing where we could gather and hear new work in Black history, where we could discuss new work in Black history. And so that was the idea behind Conversations. And obviously the Schomburg has an historic role in being such a space, being a place where people could hear the latest writing. And so that's where Conversations was born, and it has existed for 8 years, and it's always on the first Thursday of the month throughout the school year. So we're here today, we'll be here the first Thursday of October on October 1st. We will be doing, in fact, Fighting for the Franchise, a century of struggle for voting rights. And we will be joined in October by Carol Anderson, Martha Jones, Ari Berman, and Liz Theo-Harris, who is my sister. And we will be here in November. And so we will be here through May, just like we always are, in our new virtual form. So we're really excited tonight to welcome tonight's panelists. First, Ujju Aggarwal is Assistant Professor of Anthropology and Experiential Learning at the New School for Social Research and an activist who works on issues of educational justice and immigrant rights. Ernest Morrell is the Coyle Professor in Literacy Education and Director of the Center for Literacy Education at the University of Notre Dame. And Terrenda White is Assistant Professor of Sociology and Education at the University of Colorado at Boulder and a former coordinator of the Prison Education Initiative in New York City. Thank you all for being here tonight. So we're going to change this around because we have a different virtual format. So instead of formal presentations, we thought it would be better to sort of have more of a moderated conversation. And we wanted to get started with each of you giving us a little bit of background about sort of how you got started writing about the politics and history of schooling, what motivated that research, where did it begin for each of you? Ujju, why don't you start us off?
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Jean and Brian, for inviting me here today. It's really such an honor to be here and join you and such incredible co-panelists and the amazing series and space that you've really created for these conversations to happen. So thank you so much. I also want to give a shout out to my co-editors, Edwin Mayorga and Bree Pickauer, who co-edited What's Race together, who I co-edited What's Race together with, and to Brian, who is also a contributor to that volume as well. So how I come to this work, on one hand, has to do with where I grew up, which was the region of New York State between Rochester and Elmira, for those who know it, and the poorly funded public schools that I went to, what I learned and what I didn't learn there, and how that made an imprint on me about how I thought about myself, my family, and the world around me. And on the other hand, it had to do with how my life was really transformed by the communities I became part of when I moved to New York, in New York City in the early 1990s, and the organizing work that I became part of in that moment. The organizations and people that I met and who I worked with and who mentored me really had a profound impact in shaping me, but also how I came to understand educational justice as connected to a wider movement for social transformation and the need to be fully rooted in the long array of Black freedom struggles. And so part of that work for me was also part of building for over a decade of base building organization of poor and working class immigrant women of color and community members just south of the Schomburg Center, called Center for Immigrant Families and later the Parent Leadership Project. We were an organization and our work was fully rooted in popular education, which for us meant centering our stories as foundational to our analysis of the world and our organizing to change it. So in our English literacy program, as members shared our migration stories about why we came here, what we expected, what we found, more and more member stories started focusing on public schools, decreasing access, increasing language discrimination, and just discriminatory and bad treatment and disrespectful treatment, and increasing inequality among schools in the district. So this is District 3, which goes from 59th Street to 122nd Street along the west side of Manhattan. Now, some of this had to do with shifting conditions that accompanied gentrification, but also the particular context that we were in, which where there was a significant and large public and low-income housing stock that meant that even as the area gentrified, poor and working class families stayed. So we came to organize around school segregation, demanding that schools reflect, respect, and serve the communities that they were part of. And this work, which was really deeply rooted in collective struggle and community, came to inform then the questions that I would address later in my own research, which focuses more on choice, and which I then kind of came to explore in the wake of the Great Recession, so about 12 years ago. When in the context where a lot of middle-class families were reshuffling their finances and moving into private schools into public schools, away from the private schools that they had used before. So it was really in this moment where people who lived next to each other, but who rarely met, came to struggle over the shared resource of public schools, who they would serve and who they would prioritize, and what rights would mean. And later, as some might recall, that would escalate into just a few years ago, some of the most contentious rezoning battles in recent decades.
Thank you. Ernest, what brought you to this work?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for having me. And like Ujju, I just want to give a shout out to all the authors, and especially my co-editor, Ansley Erickson, who I'm sure is on right now. As you sent this question, I was thinking, when did this work start? I think it started for me almost 30 years ago as a beginning teacher in Oakland, California, where I was born and raised. And I became very interested in student voice and students engaged in research in their own communities and advocating for change, what we began to call later on youth participatory action research. And a huge part of that work for 12 years of my life, I directed a project with kids in East Los Angeles and South Central and Watts, where we were doing research in the neighborhood and advocating. And those kids began to connect with advocates from prior generations, and they had not heard of each other. And we would be in East Los Angeles at Garfield, and the old school advocates would be saying, we were doing the same thing in the 60s, or we were doing the same thing in the 40s. And we just didn't know, or the stories that the young people had access to were very limited. They only heard about who the leaders of movements were, not everyday people or young people. And so then the project became twofold. One was, how do we engage in the work of kind of unpacking this history of advocacy? At the same time, how do we represent the stories in a way that feels good and feels authentic and feels actually connected to what was going on? And so while we were still interested in, the kind of the policy struggles of the present, it became a real project. Unsilencing archives is also the work of the present. So in 2010, I was lucky enough to come to New York City to direct the Institute for Urban and Minority Education at Teachers College, what we call UMI. And it was there that I met Ansley Erickson, who was on the faculty as well. And we really began to think about what this would mean as a project, to look at histories of agency and histories of resistance, and what it would be like to do that from a perspective that we thought was critical and authentic. So for me, part of that work was connecting young people to histories of action for educational change and seeing how young people are often absent from the narrative. But there were other groups that you'll see, we'll talk about as well, like paraprofessionals and women and others who've been excluded. But really thinking about how to represent these voices, but what the voices add to the conversation. And I think that that's what we'll really talk about in the book. It's not just kind of integrating different voices, it's integrating different perspectives and the things we think we understand, we don't understand. And I'll get to that a lot more as we talk about the book, but it's for the students, it was really knowing that they're not the first to be involved in these particular movements and knowing that they're not alone. And then in the larger project, it's really acknowledging that it's hard for some of us to find ourselves in historical narratives in ways that we feel good about. And so it's not just the narrative, it's re-narrativizing. And I feel totally guilty for taking 15 people's voices and I will use the we as I'm talking for all of us. But I'll just end by saying we want to move past deficit narratives and past narratives that are not inclusive of the voices of young, of women, of everyday actors for change. It's a history from among. I know that Ujju will talk about this and Terrenda will talk about it, but it's really important work. And so that's what motivated me. That's what continues to motivate me.
Thank you. Terrenda, how about you? Where did this begin for you?
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Jean and Brian. I have to do the thank yous. Thank you to the co-editors of both books and to my co-author in Educating Harlem, Bethany Rogers. So I think I'll do what Ernest did and start with my teaching experience, which is actually pretty different. And people are actually very surprised at how I got into teaching, which was through alternative route into education. I was not prepared at all for the kind of politics and policies that really shaped some of the alternative pathways into public schools that I had been recruited heavily into. And actually my first research and writing experience was a critical policy scholar who encouraged me to write a counter narrative about my experiences in an alternative route educational program and tying that to broader issues of labor, broader issues. Brian, I love your work, by the way, so that's why I'm always reading your work. But so I got into research and policy because I was trying to make sense of how it is that many young professionals are recruited into particular schools without protections, without a sense of longevity, without even a sense of what kinds of curricula and what kinds of managers, what kinds of business models are really sort of shaping the professional choices that are available in the field. I just was not prepared for that. And so I sort of pursued a study in sociology, sort of trying to understand the social context of education and really getting into critical policies, critical theories of race, and particularly making sense of the twin sort of reforms around alternative prep programs and charter schools, different kinds of school contexts that teachers are in. And I'm sort of in a weird place now where I have the opportunity to work with elementary education majors who are thinking about where to work and being on the front end of helping sensitize generations of teachers about what does it mean to teach in particular contexts, what sort of framings of being a professional teacher or a social justice teacher or critical teacher, and what type of structures are needed to be able to do the kinds of anti-racist work that you want to do. And I would hope that that kind of research saves a lot of years and a lot of struggle for the mismatch that we see sometimes with all of the choices available for where to go to school, for where to teach, but may not be in alignment with your core values about how to teach, what's ethical and what's humane actually for kids. So that's been an 18-year journey. And that's the kind of the work I do now and how I ended up in sort of thinking about policy from the perspective of labor and sort of district reform.
Thank you. And as we can see, these are long journeys that have led to this research. And I think now we want to turn to kind of the meat of your research. Ernest, why don't we start with you? Tell us a story from your research, either about how educational inequality has manifested in practice, in discourses, or conversely, a story of struggle of one of the movements that you're writing about.
Yeah, thanks, Jean. And hopefully the story will be both. It'll be the story of the ongoing tensions between structural oppression and resistance. So when Ansley and I started this work, it's been 10 years. We started in 2011. There are three components of the project, at least, one of which is the book. We wanted to convene authors from a variety of disciplines, perspectives, to come together to help us tell a historical a narrative of resistance and structural opposition to that resistance in Harlem. And we wanted it to be multi-perspectival in a variety of ways. We've got authors from different disciplines, from history, from political science, from English, from urban studies. And we have authors who focus on different moments in time. We wanted to really substantively engage each of the decades from the 1920s up to the 90s and the 2000s. But briefly, other components of this project include a digital collection of material where we've worked with the Schomburg, as Brian well knows. And part of this work is not just telling one historical narrative, but it's unsilencing an archive so that many narratives can be told from many different perspectives. The third component, as I think Terrenda was alluding to, is a pedagogical one, where we have a component, youth historians in Harlem. And these are young people in middle school and high school that are learning how to do historical work, and they've got their own research projects, and they're sharing that work. So each of these are important to us. Who tells history? Who is history told about? And what does it mean to think about history as praxis? So the real specific story, I'll just talk about the first component of that, and that's the book. It's 13 chapters, really starting in the 1920s and moving up. Bethany and Terrenda are the final chapter. And there are major themes that I think are really important to bring out. And I'm sure this will come up even more in the Q&A. But the first is this idea of persistent and dignified struggle. And I can't, shout out all of the authors, but, we start in the 20s. Daniel Pearlstein puts Black educators at the center of the new Negro intellectual life. And Thomas Harbison looks at how parents and community members were vocally opposed to restrictive curricula around the time of the Great Depression. Craig Kreidel and Lisa Rabin look at the Teachers Union's Harlem Committee and their implementation of an anti-racist media curriculum, as early as the 1930s. We look at, how people we think we know, like Langston Hughes, had other aspects of their lives in addition to the poet that we know, John Perillo, looks at a lesser known side of Langston Hughes, who was an author of African-American history texts for children. We continue, through the post-war years with scholars like Ansley, who was only an editor, but also contributed a chapter that explored an early 1960s program initiated by Kenneth Clark, which we know as HARU, which to me kind of set this notion of youth participatory action research 50 years prior to where I was looking for it. And the kids in the neighborhoods were doing the same kind of work and coming up against some of the same kinds of struggles, but also I think realizing some of the same kinds of triumphs. Russell Rickford looked at how activists attempted to translate the Black Power movement into subversive and transformational educational practices. Kim Phillips Fine and Esther Sina look at determination of local residents to combat inhumane austerity measures that the city meted out fiscal crisis in the early 1970s. Brittany Luer looks at the work of Babette Edwards as an early advocate for vouchers and ultimately charter schools in Harlem. A second theme is that new actors, that there are new actors in the making of history, but also in the history itself. I mentioned some of them in the earlier chapters, but Clarence Taylor speaks to the visible presence of women in teachers' unions and identifies key women activists. Marta Gutman introduces the Harlem Parents Committee and other community advocates who organized to demand the building of a new and integrated school in Harlem. Nick Jurovich tells the story of local women becoming paraprofessionals. Again, Kim Phillips Fine and Esther Sine articulate the importance of the local Amsterdam news in sharing stories of resistance fiscal crisis, and as kind of a counter narrative to what you would call more popular papers like the New York Times. Another theme is we wanted to get beyond this notion of a single narrative of Harlem, a single voice, and really look to diversify perspectives. You know, I think of some of Adichie's work, The Danger of a Single Story. So our chapter authors bring to the forefront variations, tensions, debates within advocacy movements across these eras. And I think that's important for us to look at today. Toni Morrison talks about the economy of stereotype as a way to silence. And what we want to do is to speak about the multitude of voices and perspectives, all I think stemming from a indignation, but taking very different approaches and sometimes humbly disagreeing with one another. And we want to bring some of that rich divergence to the forefront. So there's no kind of single movement, no one approach to change. The chapters repeatedly highlight the diversity. Russell Rickford's chapter speaks to divergences within the Black Power framework. Brittany Luer's chapter shows contentious, not contentious, but discussions where there was, some disagreement about the voucher debate in the 1970s. Finally, we do have to think about the history of systemic opposition to this resistance, and that's what I mean. There's a history of tensions in every decade from the 20s to the present. You can find beautiful moments of resistance and agency and collectivity, but at every single turn, there's opposition. Kimberly Johnson is one of our authors who looks at a single school, Wadley, over several decades and looks at how multiple forms of structural segregation in Harlem precipitate the decline and the closing of the first Wadley that we knew. Kim Phillips-Fein and Esther Sina's chapter looks at the mid-1970s fiscal crisis and looks at how the city, when it began to suffer financially, turned first and most violently to those communities that were most vulnerable. Harlem, they argue, faced more school closures than almost any other neighborhood in the city. Bethany Rogers and Terrenda White, I didn't want to steal too much of your thunder, Terrenda. It's not that I don't love your chapter, but I know you're going to talk about it. But I will mention it briefly. Bethany Rogers and Terrenda White's chapter highlights the impact of a reconfigured Harlem educational landscape on teachers of color in Harlem, whose population fell from a high of 70% in 2000 to as low as 45% in 2015. So what we find in each era is a dialectical tension between local community agency and oppressive educational structures in an unequal city. This is the real story, and this is the story that persists. It's not a rise and fall narrative. It's not a decline and resurgence narrative. It's also not a narrative from above. About what happens in City Hall or what happens down in the Tweed building. This is about brick and mortar resistance from parents, from teachers, from students, from local community advocates. It's been a struggle. It's an ongoing struggle. As you mentioned, Brian, Schomburg's been involved in this struggle, holding it down for almost a century. People will not go away. This resistance will not go away, but hopefully what we can do, shine a light on what has happened, what we have, where we have seen victories, and not just look at this current moment as the beginning of something. It's the beginning of the next iteration of something that's been happening in Harlem as long as there have been communities here that migrated from the South and the West found themselves the victim of racial and educational injustice.
Thank you. Thank you for the story of persistent struggle and for unsilencing the archive. Terrenda, why don't you go next and sort of tell us the story from your research?
Yeah, I think I'll just sort of follow up with what Ernest sort of teased us with the chapter that Bethany and I had the opportunity to write. I think the story of what we try to tell, particularly in Educating Harlem, is who teaches in Harlem. And why and what policies shape who's there and who's not there, particularly Black teachers. What does their presence mean and what does their absence mean? And I think that is actually a pretty complicated story. We would have finished that chapter sooner if there was like one reason for that. But we found ourselves trying to make sense of two very different data points that Ernest mentioned between 1972 and 2000, where we see a predominance of Black teachers in Central Harlem. We're talking in 1972, 50% of teachers in that community district were Black, and it grew upwards of 70%, almost 70% by 2000. But the decade after that is different. We see decline in Black teachers in a Black community. And that isn't just happenstance, that's not exactly, there's a reason for that. And we're trying to make sense of how reformers, policymakers, and also the choices and agency on the part of Black teachers about where they want to teach, why they want to teach, and who they want to teach. And so it is a beautifully complicated narrative, but I think it's worth trying to piece it together, because actually Harlem is a global, it's a national story, because what I learned there is happening in Philadelphia, it's happening in Chicago, it's happening definitely in New Orleans and DC, and it becomes too coincidental to not sort of connect the dots in terms of shared stories of struggle and resistance and agency about our desire to teach Black kids. I find the 70s is the 70s up until 2000 Harlem is very interesting, where a community is also saying, we want the teachers who want to teach our kids, who see beauty in them, who see their gifts, who see their talents. And so this is on the heels of community control movements in the late 60s. This is on the heels of decentralization. But parents and community members in Harlem are saying, we don't want to be a place where white teachers in particular avoid teaching. We think that we should have teachers who see the assets of our kids and who are leveraging those assets to make learning possible. So it was an interesting moment of school leaders tapping into their informal networks to hire Black teachers, some who were certified, some who weren't, but who had identity and who had shared connection and commitment to Black kids. But it does raise this always sort of paradox of what counts as teacher quality, where does teacher identity, how does that inform what counts as quality and expertise? So Harlem was working out those kinds of narratives about teaching in the height of Black teachers in that particular context. And then we see something different. We see new leaders, we see mayoral control by the 2000s and on, particularly in 2002. We see alternative routes to education. We see a tightening of who can be hired without a credential, and simultaneously a loosening of who gets waivers, who don't have certifications, but can teach Black kids for some reason, right? And so there's a lot of strange stuff happening in the 2000s that we know culminate in a decline of Black teachers downwards of less than 50% in 15 years. And Harlem becomes a center point for charter expansion in particular. I think what so first of all, I used to live on 135th between St. Nicholas and Frederick Douglass. And then my half of the rent, this is when I knew gentrification was real. It was like my half of the rent was $1,100 and I had to move out. I was like, this is not gonna work. But I remember like walking and talking to parents. You see advertisements of particular schools. You see, you're on the bus with people who are sort of talking about education. And I really took that as an opportunity to really make my dissertation and my research as a graduate student about the charter school movement in particular in Harlem. And I was actually honored to sort of speak to some of the first Black teachers who chose to teach in charter schools. And I learned that there are, once again, to Ernest's point, there are multiple stories about how perpetual struggle for quality education and self-determination in Black communities actually created an affinity and an interest in charter schools on the part of Black residents. And most all of those early charters that I learned about between 1999 and 2005 were these community-based charter schools. Parents were on the board. They were like, I mean, it was just this like, oh, this is what it could have been forever, you know, but it changed. And it changed while I was there, you know, between the mid, 2007, definitely by 2012, 2014, we saw a very different type of charter model where I saw economies of scaling and replication and charter management organizations and people who were sort of making decisions about the education of Black kids who were not necessarily from community organizations, whose central offices were somewhere else. And that just sort of created an interesting dynamic around how a reform can start as one thing, but then be used and appropriated for very different reasons, and how Black people are trying to meet our own desires and our own struggles for education, sometimes through these reforms, in spite of them. And I think it's actually quite amazing to sort of hear some of the people in that sort of movement sort of say, this is how I thought of this movement, and this is something very different, this is something very foreign to how people conceptualize education. So anyway, we try to tell multiple stories that I think honor the nuance and complexity of what it means to be teaching in a Black community, and the struggle to sort of find the resources and the context that allow you to teach in the ways that teachers want to teach, but then also coming up against struggle and opposition of those with a very different framework, particularly from a business model, a managerial model, and teachers who were realizing in that moment of tension with very powerful central managers that it's not okay to trade off our democratic rights and our protections, and trying to figure out how they subvert, how they manage, how they navigate new systems that may not have been designed with them in mind. So that was a part of what we did in that particular chapter.
Thank you for that. And that sort of that story of change, and that story, I think, reminding us, certainly part of the struggles of the 50s and 60s was to get more Black teachers into the system. And I think part of the beginning of your story reminds us that there were real successes, real change, and then change again. Yeah, Ujju, tell us a story from your work.
Hi, so I guess what I want to begin with is just some of the experiences, the conflicting experiences of choice that we encountered, and that I later then encountered in my research. So on one hand, when we think about choice, it signals a lot of different things. And when we were organizing as the Center for Immigrant Families, back then in the early 2000s, it signaled kind of shorthand for charter schools, which many associated then with privatization, right? But then we found, again, through our organizing and through lived experience, that the practices that people were identifying with charter schools, often of differential treatment, as value assigned, and not the charter schools that you were referring to, Terrenda, but right, the ones that were growing as charter corporations more. So a different valuation that people were assigning to students based on what they predicted their test scores to be, the impact of non-state funding, and that these things were being used in the public schools all the same. So we started kind of focusing on that, and ironically at the time, it was a lot of the same people, the minority power block in the district, of primarily white parents who were really opposed to charter schools, but also very invested in defending the segregated structures from which they benefited, and which were very much rooted in policies of school choice. So then again, when I started kind of embarking on my own research in the aftermath of the Great Recession, these kind of slow processes were much more illuminated, kind of a lot more clearly, as there was this tip into the public schools from folks who had been previously going to private schools. So for example, I'll give you a couple kind of quick examples. One highly sought after school in the district, and this is again District 3. It had a wait list of the highest in the city, 125 kids for kindergarten seats. And the moment wasn't so different from today, right? It was a time of austerity measures where the city was cutting public goods and services. A lot of schools were being closed. And nearby, there was a lot of room in public schools, right? They were undersubscribed. They weren't being fought over in the same way that they might be today. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But in this moment, then the parents on this wait list use their money and political clout under the banner of the public and investing in civic life to get the city to start a new school for their children, again, in the time of austerity measures where other schools were being closed. We see this new school open up for this particular group of families. And in some ways, as I started studying more, I was reading about the segregation academies in the post-Brown South, where choice was, again, mobilized to create these enclosed spaces. I saw so many parallels, right, to what was happening in kind of the present day. And yet in this moment, in this contemporary moment, it was being done under the banner of progressive politics and investing in public and civic life. The other thing that I think really stood out a lot was that choice really structures the basics of access as a market-based principle, right? So school tours are not only common, but often required for public school access. And so again, we see marketization built into the structure of the public. You can't really oftentimes apply to a school unless you go on a school tour. And these tours were oftentimes hard to gain access to. So many members clearly saw the differences of who was valued on the school tours and who was not. That is, who the schools were really actively trying to recruit and who they were pushing aside. It was really hard, for example, for folks to get a spot on a tour, just a single spot, right? And then when we would go on the tour, we would see that many two-parent middle-class families were given access to the same tour. So they were able to acquire 2 spots on this tour that was so hard to get one for. So in response, we started organizing together to go on tours together. It was a tactic we developed at the Center for Immigrant Families to both defend and support one another, but then also monitor and document what the schools were doing. And on one tour last year, we noticed that, or actually when parents asked openly about what the school was doing to address segregation and why it was not, for example, didn't seem to want families from the nearby public housing project where some folks in our group lived, the school openly reprimanded the parents, right? And demeaned them and scolded them for asking such a question. And this is at a school that has a supposed celebrated diversity plan, which makes us then think about kind of, right, what diversity means for whom and through whose lens. And of course, this treatment then impacted how people thought about their children and how they would be treated if they did gain access to the school, right? So their own choices in choosing. If you're treated disrespectfully on a tour, are of course your lens is gonna be shifted about what, how that school might treat your kid. And I guess the other thing that I want to focus on is that, you know, a lot of times we hear about choice through the lens of white parents, right? It's about people who are supposed to be better informed, who are more savvy, who are more empowered, who have more time. But all my research and organizing has demonstrated that not to be true. It's not about people caring more. It's not about people having more time. It's not about people being more empowered or asking the right questions. And it's not by accident, right, that we see then choice emerge in the post-Brown period at a moment when universal rights come to be structured as individual private choices, that we see then the continuity from then to today of a confined and differential citizenship within a structure of universal rights, right? Guaranteeing that there's always going to be some winners and some losers. And that's how the market works, right? It's supposed to be fully participatory, but it definitely always guarantees some exclusion, even as it allows for some inclusion. And I guess one of the things that we hear then about is, well, people hoard resources, they need to make better decisions, right? They need to we need to educate people to make better decisions, but it's really the structure, right, that ends up creating a way for people to only ever be able to care about their own individual family, their own kind of individual case, right? To navigate that individually and to create a certain kind of myopia. But I guess I want to say that I saw the opposite as well, a different sensibility of care and collectivity that was born out of material conditions and daily contexts of the context of daily struggle that pushes us towards a different kind of vision. And this really was born out of the conditions of people in the same place over time, raising their kids together, right? Working together as neighbors and as co-workers, and in the tradition of other mothers, right? So expanding beyond the nuclear family towards an understanding of children as representing more than one family's future and more than one family's responsibility. So again, this kind of tradition helps us think about kind of the longer, what might be possible, and also points us towards longer histories of struggle that are not just about kind of integration or inclusion, but really about self-determination and a redistribution of resources. One that speaks to the rich tradition of the Schomburg Center itself that propels us to think about and learn about these archives that Ernest mentioned, right? About these long histories and about kind of the disjunctures that we might find along that Terrenda mentioned, right? Why do those kind of disjunctures exist, and start to question them? But also it teaches us to look for the battles that were won and sometimes the ones that were not. The organizing, for example, undertaken by the mothers of the Harlem Nine, who faced jail time in 1958 for refusing to send their children to schools that they were certain would harm them. And the organizing then that was inspired from them as well. So it's not just what they did, but what they fought for, the desire behind their demand, what people, everyday people have put their lives on the line for time and again. And it also helps us then, just kind of one last story, understand that the long history, for example, of parents in one school in District 3, parents, teachers, community members who embarked on a struggle of over 14 years, right? Rooted in the tradition of the United Bronx Parents, in the work of El Comité, in the history of the movement for community control of schools, to establish one dual language program, right? They worked from 1970 to 1984 to make one dual language program that would holistically serve and reflect the community. So when 25 years later, school administrators and elected officials end up using that mechanism of choice to marketize dual language and attract middle-class parents, it's about being clear, not just what we're fighting against, but being rooted in that long history about what we're fighting for.
Thank you, and thank you for both that kind of historical kind of look at how choice is operated, and also sort of this granular portrait of what parent organizing is looking like today. So I think many of us have welcomed over the past few years that we've finally seen the New York Times turn to kind of both covering in a more substantial way, kind of educational injustice, the kind of long history, both in of struggle and educational inequality in the city, and contemporary issues of educational inequality in the city. But I guess I wanted to say, I have some ideas of kind of where I see kind of gaps still, of stories not being told, of parts of that history that is still missing, even though we are, it is certainly a welcome change. But I guess I wanted to hear each of you maybe offer us, if you got to add one story, one gap that you would like to see the New York Times fill in the coming year, what would that be? Terrenda, can you start us?
Sure, I'll go for it. I think, so I'm in a different context. I'm in Denver, and I think the teacher strikes in the spring of 2019 and also in 2018, the statewide walkouts that we saw. In many cities, the activism hasn't stopped. There are new chapters and innovations in how teachers are organizing, even in some of the kinds of schools that I've been studying, including in charter schools. And I think I'm like really excited to learn and for folks to write about sort of innovations in teacher organizing and in teacher like what we some call social movement unionism or community-based unionism, and how in the Denver context, you know, I'm just like watching where it went next in terms of how teachers sort of found their voice and their power and their sense of agency, and that some of the old, I don't want to say old, but I think we've had to learn a lot through historic struggles about finding common forms of resistance on the part of communities of color, particularly Black communities, who have been in perpetual struggle for educational justice, and the teachers who teach them. There is not sort of a natural, or actually some really love to sort of create divisions there. And I've just seen some savvy ways in which teachers, Black teachers, white teachers have really sort of connected the struggles of their work with the struggles of the communities that they teach. And I've been in some really great places. And actually maybe the New York Times shouldn't write about it, because I think sometimes things should not be visible. Like I do think that there, you know, I read Vanessa Siddle Walker's work about what Black teachers were doing pre-Brown, you know, and the segregated, and there is a way in which they sort of were using sort of national groups to sort of do things behind the stage. And so sometimes I think to stay ahead of, like, you know, conservative movements and reforms, like sometimes we need to be a little bit more like not on the radar. But I do think that there is new levels of organizing on the part of teachers who are working in a broader idea of civil rights, labor rights, racial justice, and are connecting dots. And I think there's a global story there as well that I can't wait to learn more about. And so that's what I would offer.
Yeah, great, right. This sort of a fuller picture of teacher organizing. Ernest, what do you think?
Yeah, thank you. And I was telling Jean offline before we got on, I just found a New York Times story from 1966 that covers my mother's high school when she was just graduated, but her younger sister was a student there. And it called people who were involved in a protest wild and accused them of violence and used a form of the N-word. And at the time, no one would have batted an eye. So I guess, Jean, I think of the question in two ways. So one would be not just what stories a paper like the New York Times would tell, but who tells the stories and from what perspective. And so I'd love to see, you know, some of the young people that Ansley and others are working with through the youth historians, with the lens themselves. You know, what if we turn the camera the other way? What would we see in the same event? You know, and I understand the use of the word, but from an historical perspective, I sometimes don't think that protest describes the events that are moments of love and togetherness and friendship and advocacy for our higher humanity. And if we turn the camera the other way, we might call them different things and the people involved with them different things. But two other, like one sentence. So one, what about moments of educational magic? When the magic happens, I'd love to see that. And 1A, what about revisiting our former self as the New York Times? Bringing forward a story like the one you wrote in 1966 and telling a different story about that story. Of course, those are things that'll never happen, but one can always hope.
Right. Although, I mean, I'm not sure they can't happen because as we were talking about before, the New York Times regularly runs articles about newspapers in other cities reckoning with their historical coverage of the civil rights movement, of lynching, right? And they constantly write these stories that celebrate Southern newspapers, you know, rethinking their coverage. And so if we could see that a similar kind of spirit could possibly might be necessary for the New York Times as well. But Ujju, jump in. What if you got to?
Well, I think maybe two connected things. One is that just, again, choice is not agency. People are working to try to choose every day. It's just that coverage goes to some as choosing and really invisibilizes the labor and vision and theories of the world that others are fighting for and have been fighting for on a daily basis and for a very long time. I think, and connected then, I think this, you know, there's a way that people from the left and right of the political spectrum like to say, you know, a zip code shouldn't determine a child's future, but geographers teach us, and most New Yorkers know, that contestations determine the places we know and live, right? Resituating then schools, parks, housing, libraries, and so many more things as actively made and fought out helps us kind of then reshift that and refocus then again on the everyday contestations that are not always won, but also the labors that even go into the contestations, right? The pre-contestation labors, the work being done on the ground to even enliven that as a possibility. So again, I do agree with Terrenda that not everything needs to be necessarily made available to the New York Times, but I think also then shifting us from thinking about kind of just creating tons of maps and graphs that track how poor people choose or don't choose things, where people go or how people move, towards really thinking about envisioning and fighting for the things and thereby making the places that we need, could be a different way of entering into this conversation, especially now.
This has been a really incredible discussion, and I just want to point out that we have gotten some questions while you all have been talking, some of which have been easily answered. And so thank you for those of you who've typed questions using the Q&A feature here in the Zoom window. But please keep them coming, because we're getting closer to a part where we can have more questions from the audience. Please keep typing them in. While you're typing those questions, I want to ask one, which is about how your work, how this landscape that you've laid out so clearly helps inform how you understand the situation that we're in today. Yeah, I mean, I can't help but think about the choice that I, as a New York City parent, now have to make about whether to send my kid into a school building, but without full information about whether or not that's even safe. The landscape of what's happening for teachers, about what's happening to whole communities, and about the way choice and inequality has been structured and built into the way we're now moving into pandemic schooling. How does this history help us understand the present? Oh, I'm sorry, I was supposed to indicate who wants to go first? Well, Ujju, why don't we start with you, since you left us off talking about choice?
Sure. I mean, I think, you know, so going back to the book that Edwin, Bree, and I co-edited, one of the things that we ask authors to do is think about how do we, oh, thank you, Terrenda. At the moment, pre-pandemic, we were asking folks to think, Brian, Terrenda, and others, right, to think through kind of what, not just what we might learn about particular education reforms, how race and class, of course, work together. And so how we're thinking about racial capitalism and the state, but then also how we're thinking about crisis, right? And one thing that Ruthie Gilmore and Stuart Hall remind us of is that a crisis is about a given system not being able to reproduce itself. But it's neither good or bad, right? It's a moment where struggle over certain things, again, isn't predetermined. And it's in those moments, I think, where we really need to look backwards, and where these conversations and where the Schomburg Center really kind of propels us to look backwards as we look forwards about what we're fighting for. And I think right now, it's a moment where we really need to focus on defending and transforming any publics that remain. We see the struggles over the post office. We see struggles over public education. The Trump administration in the tax reform code built in, so I mean, they knew that we were targeting privatization in some ways, and so they built in a slow erosion of public schools into that tax reform, right? And they are doing it again, even as kind of they're rolling out these short-term measures. We have to have a longer term vision about what's then embedded in the School Choice Now Act that they're trying to push through, and other kind of reforms that they're trying to push through, which would really erode the entire infrastructure, right, of public education. Even as, so I think we really have to have learn from past struggles. I think we have to have our eyes on protecting publics, even if they haven't been perfect. They do provide a container of what we might fight for, which we don't have always in other spheres. So I think the current crisis just really makes clear that choice is broken, right? Choice is broken, and we need to defend and transform at the same time the public spheres and infrastructures that we still have.
Thank you. Terrenda?
Yeah, I would add that I think I can't help but remember how in the early phases of COVID, there was a reckoning about who our lives were depending on in terms of essential workers and people for whom their work had not been valued, not enough. And the sort of divestment in public institutions, including public schools now, we are learning that we need the most the people that have been the most sort of invested in, particularly in moments of austerity and in marketizing of public institutions. And I just hope that there's a way to extend what seem like temporary practices now. There should be some longevity. This could be the opposite of what we know has happened historically, which is where people exploit crises in particular cities to sort of enact reforms that seem to be the solution, but are very sort of disaster capitalism at work, right? And I think I'm sort of hoping that we can learn from that, but as organizers, like flip the script in the sense that all of a sudden now, the kinds of workers who are saving our lives and who are providing food for us and delivering things and teaching. And I think I remember all those sort of online memes about how people were valuing teachers all of a sudden because now they're like at home with their own kids and they're like, I need help. And so I'm just hoping that we can find a way to sort of make this not a temporary sort of like not a return to the old, because many of us were studying how problematic and violent those structures had become for those who were working in at our public institutions. And so this should be a moment where we lean in and sort of really reinvest and create solidarities and coalitions and organizers who literally saved our lives in light of this sort of pandemic we're in.
Right, thank you. And thank you for everyone typing in questions. Those are great, keep them coming. And definitely let us know if you want to ask your question yourself. Otherwise, we'll assume that you're okay with us just reading it out. Ernest, what do you think?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I'll be quick so we can get to some of the other questions. But I was thinking about a few things that we can learn from the past to contextualize this moment. One is a quote from Frederick Douglass: "Power concedes nothing without a demand." But power does concede, and I think if we look at this moment as this is as good as it's ever been, without looking at some of the historical victories as leverage points. Um, like for instance, Terrenda and Bethany's chapter, where you look at one point as many as 70% of the teachers in Harlem were teachers of color. So a historical perspective can contextualize the present in terms of where we've regressed. And I think there's tremendous leverage there. What if we had paraprofessionals of the order that we did in the late 60s and early 1970s? And what would that mean in terms of kind of integrating voices in the school system? I think that we need to think about like Russell Rickford's chapter. What the Black Power movement had in mind for what we might now call a culturally responsive education is very different than what we're thinking about. No offense to us now, but that's a different context. And there's so much out there to help us understand how to advocate, how to use historical moments as leverage, how to learn how best to navigate differences in a way that doesn't cause divisions that allow us to be run over by forces that we can mutually agree upon that are oppressive. Sometimes the silence is from too divergent a set of perspectives. So I think we can learn a lot about the how, but I think there are some specific points of leverage. How to have a more representative teaching force, what it means to teach from a standpoint of racial justice and work that Ujju and her co-editors are involved in, not only around the curriculum but about the issue of choice and parent engagement, what that looks like. So I think if we asked ourselves, what are we most proud of from the past that we've lost that we'd like to get back again? And when were we most successful in coming together to create coalitions for change and to learn from that how?
Thank you. Okay, we're getting a lot of questions here. I'm going to read some of them out. Let me read two, and just, whoever wants to respond, go for it. First is from Christopher. In what ways do you think would be most important for funding of public education to be changed in order to facilitate substantive educational justice? So I think it's a question about in what ways does funding need to change in order for there to be educational justice. And another from Aaron, what have you noticed about the history that is or is not taught in teacher training programs, traditional and or alternative? So what parts of this are in teacher education? What parts are teachers missing? Who wants to go first?
Maybe I can answer that last question, which is to a point, Ernest, that you made earlier about history as praxis. I'm a sociologist by training and I teach foundations, but I work with, incoming majors in education. And it does strike me how absent some of the history is around how communities, before teachers show up, like, do we know the depth of struggle? And that could really save us from some of the savior-like colonial models of like, we're delivering something to communities. No, we are hoping to be in partnership or co-conspirators, as Bettina Love says, with communities in their struggles for justice. But I think teacher education could do a lot more with sensitizing teachers to histories of struggle such as Harlem, and even histories of labor and organizing. I think is also missing there. And I think I definitely think that for teacher ed, and I think that for alternative route programs as well. I think, and I also think it could temper, there's a popularity now with recruiting teachers of color. Like there was a recent, policy brief from NEPC, the National Education Policy Center, written by Thomas Phillip and Anthony Brown about what is that? Is there something strange about wanting to recruit teachers of color for very utilitarian sort of test score production, race match effect type of like, it can be a very narrow way to think about the role and the pedagogical value that teachers of color bring, particularly Black teachers. And so how do we not allow sort of market-based, competitive-oriented narratives to even shape the appropriation of, oh yes, we want more teachers of color for very slotted reasons, but aren't about transforming that the systems, the schools, the ideas, the deficit views, and even recognizing the assets that the Black teachers bring. And I think these kinds of historical narratives really help push back on narrow approaches to these kinds of diversity models.
And by the way, I'd just like to add a question from Cynthia into Christopher's question about funding, because it's related. Cynthia asks a question about, she asks, would you discuss the role gifted programs played in segregating the public schools and also schools with PTAs where they have their own 501c3s? And, I think the stories, they do $1 million fundraisers and that sort of thing.
Sure, I can jump in there for a minute. It's now, I think it's such an important question, first of all, because this ability to give, your private individual money to your own school has created a problem. It's one that, I'm so heartened that today, with the increasing kind of attention and consciousness, it is, questions around centralizing donations and redistributing them equitably is finally on the table. I can say when we raised it as the Center for Immigrant Families over a decade ago, we were literally run out of the room and in fear, but so yes, and there's models that we researched before. There's models for how to do that. Other school districts around the country have done it. But it does create some real contentious discussions, because again, this eliminates the idea about individual choice and public goods. And I think that then we have to be ready to really not just center the people, as the press has done, who are contesting it. We have to be centering the people who are calling for it, and why it's necessary, right? The people who have been organizing for it, the parents who are saying that, no, it's not okay to have all these, to have PTAs with exploding budgets, and then another school be doing a drive to make sure that every child has a warm winter coat, right? Because so that's not okay. And we need to center those voices and center those families in the discussion, instead of just kind of the big headlines about kind of the parents contesting and what they're going to do and pull out of the public school system, right? If they don't get to keep their individual private dollars to their schools. I think one other thing real quick about the gifted and talented, yes, it's a problem. But another shift we've seen, so when I mentioned dual language programs, there's been a way that dual language programs really have shifted in many places towards kind of in New York and in certain places, not all over the city, but in certain districts and communities, they've been used to create a bastion, another kind of privatized bastion like gifted and talented programs have as well, in schools, inside of schools that have a huge wealth of resources, and where there's great disparities, again, inside the same school. But again, the mechanism that has allowed for that is often choice. So I think we need to kind of look at kind of what's holding the glue together amongst these different things, so that as we get rid of one thing, as we push to get rid of gifted and talented, And this goes back to the Hydra model that Edward and Bree and folks from NICOR developed in the first edition. Another kind of head doesn't spring up in the monster to say, well, we're going to kind of extract resources or dispossess public schools in this way, if not from that way. So we have to kind of be holistic in our thinking, as others have indicated. I think as Terrenda mentioned around the idea of coalitions, right? We need to have, it's not just that we need to fight together to support each other. We need each other to understand the fullness and complexity of what we're fighting.
Yeah. I would just briefly add that to something that Terrenda said, in addition to having more classes or more content on the history of education, I think teacher education just needs to be integrated with more voices, local voices. We need opportunities for pre-service teachers to hear from young people, not just their students in the classroom, but maybe young people that aren't their students, to hear from parents, to hear from, other groups. It would be nice to have kind of standing panels and just kind of interdialogues and to think about how knowing those perspectives outside of articles or lesson plans might influence teachers. Right now, I think that the bandwidth of information is too narrow to really understand the practice or the context within which the practice is situated.
Thank you all. I want to ask another question that we got, and just kind of preface it because I think it's referring to something that everybody will understand who's not in New York or may not be familiar with the history, which is that in 1968, there was a series of strikes that the teachers union went on strike several times, in part protesting or challenging the way a section of the Black community was trying to get control of their schools. This is 1968. And I'm curious actually to know how all three of you think about that context today. And also, I guess for me, and maybe this is me, it's sneaking in my own question, is about this ongoing tension or the work that has to be done to bring together, especially in New York City because of this history, to bring together teachers and community. And I know many teachers and teacher activist groups have been working on this, in part having more Black teachers, having more teachers of color helps when you have overwhelmingly students of color and overwhelmingly white teachers. To change that demographic helps. But I think there's also political work that people are doing to try to come together and find genuine common cause and solidarity. And I know there was a proposed or a planned New York City teacher strike in the air again this fall over unsafe conditions in the schools. So how do we look back at this history? How do you three understand this history of 1968? And let me just read Anna's question. She writes, I'd like to know about the validity of criticisms of Black community-run schools and school boards under decentralization policies in the 80s and 90s as being corrupt or troubled. How much of this narrative is rooted in structural racism or white supremacy as to the ability of communities to run their own schools? And then related to that, where is the role for Black leadership, the ability of Black leaders to hire teachers from within school communities within the context of district collective bargaining contracts? Maybe Terrenda should start us off since you've
From what I'm hearing about the question, I think we have to acknowledge that moment. I think it's Ernest's point about who's narrating these histories. When you read people who participated in, we're thinking of the Ocean Hill Bronzeville community strike, and there were some schools in Harlem actually, demonstration schools. Who gets to tell that story? Is it the community members and some of those district leaders who, when they tell that narrative, is very different? And so I think that question about questioning the validity, if it's a majoritarian narrative, if it's a narrative about almost feeding into deficit ideas about Black leaders, that's a problem. But I think there are I think it might go back to the I think you called it the interdialogue, Ernest, around if you bring multiple, almost like a panel type of thing. I think that needs to happen amongst not just historians, but people who lived that moment and how they understand it. And how do you honor that struggle and honor those who felt very strongly about wanting control of their schools and curriculum and teaching, and how that bumps up against teacher autonomy and teacher rights and all. That's tricky, but I don't think we get anywhere when we have two simple stories and stories that are not from folks in that community. So I question the validity of some of those narratives, but I think we have many others contexts that teach us how to do that better in terms of communicate across, in terms of bringing multiple voices to the table, in terms of having dialogue about how do we find our shared struggle in the current moment, and learn from those histories in productive ways. And so I don't know if that answers the question. But I think it is about who's telling narratives, and that's a problem in many other domains as well.
So, I was just going to jump in real quick, and in some ways, Anna's question, she answers her question in some ways that I think are really profound in the statement she makes. And I would just, if you do have the book, or you're going to get it, I would point you to a couple of chapters, Russell Rickford's chapter and Clarence Taylor's chapter. As you know, and I know Ujju and Brian are shaking their heads, this history is fraught, and mistakes have been made, and there's what constitutes a union and what a union does is a moving target in New York, from the 40s through the 60s. But in the moments I think that were most profound, what happened was exactly what Terrenda is talking about, where you have parents and you have community members and teachers working together and thinking about what shared interests are. The us versus them narrative is not going to help students at all. And the notion that the people who are of a community cannot have meaningful roles in schools in that community is a non-starter for change. So I think it would be good for us to look back at that. I shudder to use the word history in the singular, the histories of how the union in New York City, unions in New York City have formed and reformed themselves. But if we start with a couple of presuppositions, we start with rules for engagement, and we start honoring that there have been some mistakes made to isolate and alienate members of communities around the control of schools, I think we'd be on better footing to move forward. But I appreciate the question, because the question, the critique is inherent in the question, and it's one I agree with.
Yeah, I think just to jump in, I agree with everything that Terrenda and Ernest said, and just want to kind of echo it. I also learned so much from the work of Clarence Taylor and Russell Rickford. I also just think in terms of where we might look, like, I think that yes, and the critique being embedded in the question, but I think we can also look to models from today, right? I mean, what people have built, for example, in Chicago is profound and deep and powerful. And it didn't just happen overnight, but it was based on deep, deep relationships that people spent, again, not covered by the press. This is not what we'll learn from reading the news all the time, right? But we do know it from being in community and working in community. We know that those relationships between teachers and parents and communities were built over time, so that when things did break, there was a whole infrastructure of relationships to hold it, and solidarities to ground it. So.
Yeah, thank you, Ujju. And it's some of those stories from Chicago and Seattle and other places are stories I'm trying to tell in my contribution to the What's Race book. Thank you all for all of these. We're running very short on time. I want to give each of you an opportunity to give just kind of last thoughts, like something else that hasn't fit into the conversation, but that you'd like to say before we call it a night. Ujju.
Just to say yes, definitely read Brian's chapter in the What's Race book. He charts the problem to the kind of the contemporary in a really profound, and yeah, you'll learn a lot, and I hope you will read it. I think one quick correction to what I said before, kind of context, I wanted to also say that dual language programs, as I noted, really arose from a desire to build an alternative from bilingual education programs that were with understanding children, immigrant children as deficits, right? So the vision and what they were grounded in, that history is very powerful, and that's what I hope we can protect away from a market model. Yeah, and finally in closing, I guess I would just say thank you for this conversation. I learned so much. I think this is a time where we need so many more conversations like this, particularly that connect the kind of historical to the contemporary and give us a framework through which to think. I know for myself, I feel very kind of harried by the everyday in our world. So to be able to pause and learn and think together and to create that space through this lens of conversations in Black freedom studies is so very, very, very critical. So thank you.
Terrenda?
I'll just add that I think the book What's Race has got I think it offers some really strong theoretical grounding for both race and capitalism, and sort of the market systems in play. And it was I think the editors, and I realized I haven't talked much about the chapter in that book. Don't kill me, Bree and Edwin and Ujju. But what I think that book really pushed me as a writer also to sort of think about this like either or type of thing. We're in a business model of schooling, and there is ways to push against it and resist, but I think we have to know what this is. And I sort of appreciate theories around whiteness as property and accumulation by dispossession, and understanding the kinds of just being able to name what's happening in our communities, and to sort of say that is not actually empowering. That, you know, things are called empowering, but they don't really feel very empowering. And I think that book has a way of helping to sort of name power, but also to name powers among people who are pushing against it, and to sort of be connected to NICOR and other organizations that are pushing against, but really being precise in like what we're sort of facing, and how this current moment could also be appropriated in similar ways historically, with pushing to sort of deregulate, you know, defund and all these kinds of things. We have to be really keen on the games that are being played is how I sort of think about it. So I just wanted to add that, because I don't think I talked enough about how those frameworks in that book really helped me to sort of piece together the larger connected hydras that we're up against.
Thank you. Ernest.
Yep. First of all, just sorry to Ansley and all the authors for all the things I didn't say about your wonderful chapters in the book. But Ansley, I think, is in the chat, and she's put in some links to some free digital resources, including a digital edition of the book. But I just want to end with a statement and a shout out to the Schomburg. Really, the unsilencing archives is always good work, even in the midst of a social movement, because we see the present through the lens of the past. And this isn't like what we do after this moment. This is what we do for this moment. Contributing to archives, but no one has done archives of resistance in the Black community better than the Schomburg for 100 years. Bring your students to the Schomburg. Exhaust the archives, ask questions of the archives that we have to demand answers to through our historical work. I've been telling my students the archival work is the genius of the next generation of historians. because it is the archive going to make this the historical narrativizing possible. So that's work we do together by contributing to the archives, but by using what's there. When we get back in person, bring your students to the Schomburg. Also, just check out and support the work of youth historians.
Thank you, three, Ernest, Ujju, and Terrenda. And thank you, Jean, Theo Harris, co-moderator tonight. And thank all of you for tuning in. Some of you asked where this will live after the fact and if you can show it to other students or people in other places. Google Schomburg and live stream. And pretty soon, give us a moment, we will get this video up to that website. Thanks to everyone. Thanks for coming, and we'll see you October 1st for the next event in Conversations in Black Freedom Studies series. And don't forget to get the books. Stay safe, everyone.